The early pioneers who traveled from Missouri to California faced unbelievable obstacles and hardships. Along their 2,000-mile journey, they faced countless rivers, barren deserts, and nearly impenetrable mountains. And while we often think of the deserts and mountains as being the most difficult part of the journey, crossing the many rivers that crisscrossed their paths was just as difficult and equally treacherous. After leaving jumping-off points such as Independence, Missouri, or Council Bluffs, Iowa, they encountered a number of rivers blocking their path westward. The Kansas, the Blue, Vermilion, both the North and South Platte, the Big and Little Sandy, and the Green River. And farther west, the Truckee, the Yuba, the Bear, the Feather, and the American. When they reached these rivers, they had to make a critical choice. Should they ford the river, simply try to float their wagons across, or use a ferry to transport them to the other side? Regardless of the method chosen, it was paramount to prevent water from soaking the travelers' provisions. This was literally a matter of life and death. For some of these rivers, such as the Truckee, there was only one choice. Due to its narrow width and steep banks, pioneers were forced to take their wagons into the rocky riverbed. But for other rivers, the answer could depend on the time of the year. Before the spring rains, some rivers, such as the Platte, were shallow with a stable riverbed and could be easily forded. But when large rainstorms occurred, these rivers could become raging torrents with dangerous currents that could sweep wagons, people, and livestock swiftly downstream. Regardless of the method used to cross a river or stream, the key was to make the crossing before camping, if possible, to avoid being stranded by a flash flood. But just getting to the river itself was often a daunting task. Sometimes the early pioneers would have to cut down the river or stream banks to reach the water, a tedious and time-consuming task using pickaxes and shovels. And even then, men would still need to gently ease the wagons down the steep slope by tying a long rope to the axle of the wagons. Where the crossings were shallow, wagon boxes could be raised by putting blocks on the axles. For deeper water, 8 or more teams would be hitched to one wagon, which allowed one of the teams to always be on solid ground and have some degree of control over those that were swimming. Floating wagons across the river was a very tedious, time-consuming, and often dangerous process. The wagon box or bed was made of hardwoods to resist shrinking in the dry air of the plains and deserts. The box was 2 to 3 feet deep, and when the cracks were sealed with tar, wax, or rosin, it could be rendered watertight to float across slow-moving rivers. Another method for sealing the wagon beds was to use buffalo hides. They would be stretched and sewed over the box of the wagon, flesh side out, and then dried in the sun. Then sealed with a mixture of tallow and ashes. Floating wagons across rivers could be perilous. Unexpected currents or eddies could quickly push the wagons downstream. To prevent this, ropes held by men on horseback or on one of the banks were used to stabilize the wagons. Sometimes 2 or more wagons would be lashed together for more stability, but if the wagon was not properly balanced, it could easily tip over, putting the owner's contents and even their lives at risk. Larger rivers, especially those at the beginning of the journey, often had ferry crossings that transported entire wagons across to the opposite shore. These would be operated by enterprising settlers in the area, or even Native Americans, setting up toll booths to force immigrants to pay for the crossing. Charges ranged up to $16, almost the price of an oxen, and it is reported that one ferry earned $65,000 in just one summer. While the immigrants often complained bitterly about the prices, it was usually the safest method for crossing rivers. When commercial ferries weren't available, especially in the early days, the pioneers would sometimes resort to building their own ferries or barges to cross. Multiple canoes hewn from logs would be lashed together, a wagon rolled on crossways, and the resulting ferry poled across. But this method was very time-consuming and depended on the availability of trees from which to build the canoes or barges. Regardless of the method used, crossing rivers was always hazardous. In fact, simply crossing on horseback could be dangerous. In December 1844, John Murphy of the Stevens Townsend Murphy Party, while descending the Sierra Nevada mountains via the American River, was swept from his horse by the swiftly flowing water. Found clinging to a tree branch far downstream, he was revived by his companions and survived his harrowing experience, going on to be a prominent figure in the history of early California. And let's don't forget about the livestock. They would be forced to swim across the deeper rivers, often panicking in the process and being swept downstream, never to be seen again. And if they did make it to the other side, they would sometimes get stuck in the deep mud. While a gruesome decision, in the interest of keeping the wagon train moving, they were often left to die. Despite all the obstacles and hardships, the pioneering spirit of the early settlers never wavered. And they did indeed get to the other side of the river, starting a new life in lands full of promises for a new and brighter future.